In the affluent suburbs of Chicago, a summa cum laude graduate was about to face the most devastating moment of her life. What started as a celebration dinner took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her father's brutal honesty. Say, Sullivan wasn't your typical overachiever. For 5 years, she had spent her life chasing the ghost of her deceased brother Michael, known for sacrificing her authentic dreams to honor his memory. When she encountered her father's wine-fueled toast at her graduation party, she had no idea she was walking into a moment that would shatter everything. Emma heard words that would lead to the complete reconstruction of her family's mythology. What began as academic triumph would become a journey toward authenticity. The Sullivan family would never be the same after Emma discovered the courage to disappoint her way into living her own truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Sullivan adjusted her cap one final time as the processional music swelled around her. The black mortarboard felt foreign against her auburn hair, the tassel catching the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows of Northwestern University's Ryan Field. Around her, hundreds of graduates shifted in their seats, excitement crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. She should have felt it too, that intoxicating mixture of relief and triumph that comes with crossing a finish line 4 years in the making. Instead, she felt nothing. The dean's voice echoed across the stadium as he began calling names for the biomedical engineering graduates. Emma's hands lay still in her lap, watching as her classmates bounced in their seats, some already crying with joy. She remembered when she'd first chosen this major, sitting in her high school guidance counselor's office with a stack of college brochures spread before her like tarot cards revealing an uncertain future. Michael would have loved this program, she'd thought then, running her finger along the Northwestern brochure's edge. He always said biomedical engineering was where you could really make a difference. The memory felt distant now, filtered through years of late nights in the library, organic chemistry problem sets that made her eyes burn, and the constant weight of living up to a ghost's expectations. Michael had been dead for 5 years, but his presence in her academic choices felt more real than her own interests ever had. Emma Marie Sullivan. Her name cut through the haze of memory. She stood automatically, muscle memory from countless rehearsals guiding her legs toward the stage. The dean smiled as he handed her the diploma, his practiced warmth reflecting off her magna cum laude cord. The photographer's flash popped. Her parents would frame this moment, she knew. Another achievement to display on their mantle, right next to Michael's high school valedictorian portrait. As she walked back to her seat, Emma caught sight of her family in the stands. Her father Patrick sat rigid, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her mother Carol waved enthusiastically, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Between them sat an empty space that Emma had learned to navigate around, the invisible presence that had shaped every major decision of her life. She remembered the night she'd almost changed her major to environmental science. It was junior year, after a guest lecture on renewable energy systems that had left her buzzing with genuine excitement for the first time in months. She'd actually drafted the paperwork, fingers hovering over the submit button on her laptop screen. But then she'd seen the framed photo on her desk, Michael in his white coat during his brief stint in medical school, looking confident and purposeful in a way Emma had never quite managed. The paperwork went into her trash folder. She'd finished her biomedical engineering coursework with a 3.9 GPA and the hollow satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Emma! Her roommate Jessica bounded over as the ceremony began to disperse. Graduation, cap askew and mascara slightly smudged from happy tears. Can you believe we did it? 4 years of pure hell and we actually survived. Emma managed a smile that felt like putting on a mask. Yeah, it's surreal. The whole crew's going to Murphy's pub to celebrate. You coming? The invitation hung in the air between them. Emma could picture it. Her classmates crowded around sticky tables, sharing war stories from their hardest classes, making elaborate plans for the future. The kind of celebration she'd watched from the periphery for 4 years but never quite felt entitled to join. Actually, I have to get home. Family dinner. Jessica's expression softened with understanding she didn't quite possess. Right, of course. Well, text me later, okay? And Em? She squeezed Emma's shoulder. You should be proud. magna cum laude in biomedical engineering? That's incredible. Incredible. The word felt like it belonged to someone else. As Jessica disappeared into the crowd of celebrating graduates, Emma found herself standing alone in the emptying stadium. Families streamed past her, children shrieking with excitement as they ran between the folding chairs. She watched a father lift his graduate daughter onto his shoulders, both of them laughing as her cap tumbled to the ground. Emma? She turned to find Dr. Elena Vasquez approaching, her silver hair catching the late sunlight. Emma's environmental chemistry professor looked elegant in her faculty robes, but her dark eyes held a warmth that Emma had always found comforting during office hours. "Congratulations," Dr. Vasquez said, her accent lending weight to the words. "Though you don't look much like someone celebrating." Emma's carefully constructed composure wavered. "Thank you, Dr. Vasquez. I'm just processing everything, I guess. May I walk with you?" They moved slowly through the dispersing crowd, Dr. Vasquez's presence creating a pocket of calm in the chaos. "I wanted to speak with you about an opportunity," she said after a moment. "There's a research position opening up in my renewable energy lab, advanced materials for solar applications. I think you'd be perfect for it." Emma's steps faltered. That's very kind of you to think of me, but I'm planning to apply for medical school programs, following the pre-med track." Dr. Vasquez stopped walking, studying Emma's face with the intensity she usually reserved for particularly complex chemical equations. "Is that what you want? Or what you think you should want?" The question hung between them like a live wire. Emma felt something inside her chest crack. A careful wall she'd built over years of dutiful choices and inherited dreams. "I should probably get going," Emma said finally. "My family's expecting me." Dr. Vasquez nodded, but she pressed a business card into Emma's hand. "Think about it. The position doesn't start until fall, but I'd need to know soon. Sometimes, the path we think we should take isn't the one that will make us happy." As Dr. Vasquez walked away, Emma stared down at the card. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Environmental Engineering, Sustainable Energy Research Lab. The words seemed to pulse with possibility, with a future she'd never allowed herself to fully imagine. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Can't wait to celebrate tonight. Dad's so proud. Michael would be too." Emma's throat tightened. Even now, in her moment of academic triumph, Michael's shadow stretched across her achievement. She slipped the business card into her purse and began the long walk to her car, where her family waited to drive her home to a celebration that felt more like a performance than a party. The suburbs of Chicago stretched before her, manicured, lawns and pristine driveways leading to houses where families gathered to mark milestones and pretend that absence wasn't the loudest voice in the room. As she drove through streets she'd known since childhood, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading towards something that would change everything, though she couldn't yet see what form that change would take. The business card felt heavy in her purse, a small seed of possibility in the carefully cultivated garden of her parents' expectations. For the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to choose a path simply because it called to her, rather than because it honored a memory that had become more burden than blessing. But that wondering would have to wait. Tonight was for celebration, for family dinner and toasts to her success in a field that had never quite felt like home. The questions Dr. Vasquez had raised would keep until tomorrow, or so Emma told herself as she pulled into her childhood driveway, where her parents stood waiting with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, and a feast prepared in honor of dreams that had never truly been her own. Emma pulled into the circular driveway of her childhood home, the familiar sight of the Tudor-style house doing little to ease the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The business card from Dr. Vasquez seemed to burn through her purse as she sat in her car for a moment longer than necessary, watching her parents through the front window as they made final preparations for the evening's celebration. The house looked exactly as it had since her junior year of high school. Immaculate landscaping, fresh paint, and the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Carol had clearly spent the afternoon arranging flowers and setting out the good china, the same ritual she'd performed for every milestone since Michael's death. Emma could see her mother's silhouette moving efficiently through the dining room, her movements carrying the practiced grace of someone who had learned to manage expectations as carefully as she managed dinner parties. As Emma gathered her cap, and gown from the passenger seat, she noticed Sam Rivera's beat-up Honda Civic pulling up behind her. Relief flooded through her chest at the sight of her best friend climbing out of his car, his dark hair still damp from what was clearly a hurried shower. Sam had driven straight from his own graduation ceremony at UIC, where he'd finished his social work degree with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 4 years of juggling school with 2 part-time jobs. "There's our biomedical engineer," Sam called out, his grin wide and genuine in a way that made Emma's earlier numbness feel even more pronounced. "How does it feel to be officially smarter than the rest of us?" "Like a fraud," Emma said before she could stop herself. Sam's expression shifted, his dark eyes studying her face with the practiced attention of someone trained to read emotional distress. What's wrong? This should be the best day of your life." Emma glanced toward the house, where she could see more cars arriving. Uncle Tom's silver Lexus, Grandma Sullivan's ancient but pristine Buick, and a few vehicles she didn't immediately recognize. The weight of the evening ahead pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. "Just nervous about tonight, I guess." Sam stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This is about your dad, isn't it? What did he say now?" Before Emma could answer, the front door opened and Carol emerged, her smile bright enough to power the neighborhood. She wore the navy dress she reserved for special occasions, and her graying hair was styled in the soft waves that Patrick had always said reminded him of Grace Kelly. The resemblance was striking, though Emma had learned to recognize the tension that lived behind her mother's practiced elegance. "Emma, sweetheart, there you are. And Sam, thank you so much for coming." Carol's voice carried across the driveway with the warmth she'd perfected during her years as Patrick's wife, the kind of hostess charm that made everyone feel welcome while revealing nothing about the woman underneath. "Wouldn't miss it, Mrs. Sullivan. Emma's been working toward this for 4 years." As they walked toward the house, Emma caught sight of her reflection in the front window, cap and gown making her look older, more serious, like someone who had earned the right to make decisions about her own life. The image felt foreign, as if she were looking at a stranger wearing her face. Inside, the house hummed with the kind of controlled energy that preceded Sullivan family gatherings. Emma could hear Uncle Tom's voice from the kitchen, his laugh mixing with the clink of glassware, as someone opened what was undoubtedly an expensive bottle of wine. The dining room table had been extended to accommodate the guest list, Carol's wedding china gleaming under the chandelier that had been Patrick's first major purchase after his medical device company had turned its first real profit. "Emma," Grandma Sullivan's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. At 78, Patricia Sullivan remained a force of nature, her silver hair pulled back in the same chignon she'd worn since her husband's funeral 40 years ago. She approached with the measured steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world on her own terms, her blue eyes sharp with an intelligence that age had only sharpened. "Grandma." Emma accepted the fierce hug that smelled of Chanel No. 5 and the peppermints her grandmother had carried in her purse for as long as Emma could remember. "Magna cum laude," Grandma Sullivan said, holding Emma at arm's length to study her face. "Your grandfather would have been proud. He always said the Sullivan women were made of stronger stuff than most people realized." The comment carried weight in a way that Emma didn't quite understand, though she'd learned over the years that her grandmother's observations usually contained layers of meaning that revealed themselves over time. Before she could respond, more guests began arriving in rapid succession. Family friends from the country club, a few of Patrick's business associates, and Dr. Morrison, who had been Michael's pediatrician and had remained close to the family even after Michael's death. Emma found herself swept into a receiving line of sorts, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about her future plans, with the same carefully rehearsed responses she'd been perfecting for months. Yes, she was planning to apply to medical school. No, she hadn't decided on a specialty yet. Yes, she was excited about following in Michael's footsteps. Each lie felt like swallowing glass. "Emma, dear, your father was just telling us about your plans for medical school," said Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose primary qualification for friendship with the Sullivan family seemed to be her ability to remember everyone's business with encyclopedic precision. "Michael would be so proud to see you continuing the family tradition." Emma's smile felt like it might crack her face. "That's very kind of you to say. Though I suppose it must be difficult, living up to such high standards. Michael was always so exceptional, wasn't he? Even as a child, you could tell he was destined for greatness." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, though she'd heard variations of the same sentiment at every family gathering for the past 5 years. She was saved from having to respond by Sam, who materialized at her elbow with 2 glasses of wine and the kind of protective energy that had made him such a crucial anchor throughout college. "Mrs. Henderson, have you met Emma's friend Sam? He just graduated from UIC's social work program, summa cum laude, actually." The redirection was smooth, and Emma felt a surge of gratitude as Sam launched into a conversation about his internship at a community mental health center. She used the distraction to scan the room, looking for an escape route that wouldn't draw unwanted attention. Instead, she found herself making eye contact with Uncle Tom, who was standing near the fireplace with a glass of scotch and an expression of careful observation. At 45, Tom Sullivan possessed the kind of emotional intelligence that his older brother had never quite managed, a quality that had served him well in his career as a family therapist. He'd been the one to suggest that Patrick seek counseling after Michael's death, advice that had been politely declined and never mentioned again. Tom raised his glass in a small salute, his eyes carrying a warmth that reminded Emma why she'd always felt more comfortable in his presence than in her father's. There was something in his expression tonight that suggested he was seeing more than just graduation celebration, a professional awareness that made Emma wonder what he'd observed during his years of watching the Sullivan family navigate their grief. The front door opened again, and Emma's stomach dropped as she recognized the voices of more family friends, including the Morettis, whose son had been Michael's roommate during his brief time in medical school. Tony Moretti Jr. had been at the funeral, she remembered, his young face drawn with genuine grief as he'd shared stories about Michael's brilliance and dedication to his studies. "Patrick! Carol! Congratulations!" Mr. Moretti's booming voice carried across the room as he embraced Emma's parents. "You must be so proud. First Michael, now Emma following in his footsteps. What a legacy!" Emma watched her father's face during the exchange, noting the way his expression brightened at the mention of Michael's name in a way it never quite did when discussing her own achievements. Patrick Sullivan had built his medical device company on the foundation of precision and control, qualities that had served him well in business, but had left him struggling to navigate the messy emotional landscape of loss and fatherhood. "Actually," Patrick said, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "Emma's already been accepted to several pre-med programs. We're just waiting to hear back from Northwestern's medical school. Wouldn't that be something? Both my children at the same institution." The words hit Emma like ice water. She hadn't applied to any pre-med programs. They'd discussed the possibility in abstract terms, but she'd never actually submitted applications or taken the MCAT. The lie was so bold, so completely divorced from reality, that for a moment she wondered if she'd misheard. But the approving murmurs from the gathered guests confirmed that Patrick had indeed announced her enrollment in programs that existed only in his imagination. Emma felt the room spin slightly, the weight of expectations and deception pressing down on her lungs, until breathing became a conscious effort. Sam appeared at her side again, his hand finding her elbow in a gesture of support that was subtle enough to avoid drawing attention. "You okay?" he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I need some air," Emma whispered back. But before they could make their escape, Patrick was calling for everyone's attention, raising his glass in preparation for what Emma recognized as the traditional Sullivan family toast. The room quieted, faces turning expectantly toward the patriarch who had somehow convinced himself that his daughter's future was as certain as his version of the past. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass. Dr. Vasquez's business card, a sharp reminder in her purse of the choice she hadn't yet found the courage to make. Around her, the assembled guests waited for words of celebration and pride, unaware that they were about to witness the moment when carefully constructed family mythology would collide with the reality of a daughter who had never quite learned how to disappoint the people she loved most. The weight of the lie Patrick had just told settled around Emma's shoulders like a shroud, and she realized with crystalline clarity that whatever happened next would determine whether she spent the rest of her life living in service to a ghost, or finally found the courage to disappoint her way into authenticity. Patrick Sullivan stood at the head of the dining room table, his wine glass catching the light from the chandelier above as conversations gradually died away. Emma watched her father's face transform into what she'd learned to recognize as his public speaking expression. The same confident mask he wore during board meetings and country club speeches, where charm and authority had built the foundation of his success. "Friends, family," Patrick began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of people. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Emma's remarkable achievement." Emma's wine glass felt slippery in her hands as she forced herself to smile and nod at the appropriate moments. Around the table, faces beamed back at her with the kind of uncomplicated joy she envied. Uncle Tom's genuine pride, Grandma Sullivan's fierce satisfaction, Sam's supportive grin that carried just a hint of concern around the edges. 4 years ago, when Emma started at Northwestern, Carol and I knew we were watching something special unfold. Patrick's gaze swept the room before landing on Emma with an intensity that made her stomach clench. Magna cum laude in biomedical engineering, the same program that attracted Michael, though he was called to serve our country before he could complete his degree. The familiar revision of history landed like a physical blow. Michael hadn't left medical school to serve his country. He'd been failing his classes, struggling with depression that none of them had recognized or acknowledged. But Patrick's version had calcified over the years into something that sounded true enough to repeat in public. A mythology that protected everyone from the messier reality of mental illness and academic failure. Tonight, we celebrate not just Emma's academic excellence, but her commitment to following in her brother's footsteps. Patrick's voice grew stronger, more certain, as if the act of speaking could make his version of events more real. "She's already been accepted to several pre-medical programs, and we're hopeful that Northwestern Medical School will recognize what we've always known, that the Sullivan family produces doctors who change the world." Emma's vision blurred slightly around the edges. The lie felt massive in the room, expanding to fill every corner with its implications. She could see Mrs. Henderson nodding approvingly, Dr. Morrison raising his glass with professional solidarity, the Morettis exchanging glances that suggested they were already composing congratulatory messages to share with their own social circle. "I remember when Michael first told us he wanted to study medicine," Patrick continued, his voice taking on the reverent tone he always used when speaking about his dead son. "He was 7 years old, and he'd just watched me help his mother bandage a scraped knee. 'I want to fix people too, Dad,' he said. And God, how he would have excelled." The room had gone completely silent now, even the ambient sounds of the suburban evening muted by the weight of Patrick's words. Emma found herself studying her father's face, seeing something she'd never quite noticed before, the way his features softened when he spoke about Michael, becoming younger somehow, more vulnerable. This wasn't just grief, she realized. This was love in its purest form, unmarked by disappointment or expectation. "Michael had this gift," Patrick said, his voice catching slightly. "This natural compassion combined with brilliant analytical thinking. The kind of mind that comes along once in a generation." His eyes found Emma again, and she saw something flicker across his expression. A shadow that might have been comparison, might have been regret. He would have revolutionized cardiac surgery, I'm certain of it. The breakthroughs he could have made. Emma's throat felt tight as she watched her father construct a future for Michael that would never exist, a career built on potential rather than reality. She could feel Sam's tension beside her, could see Uncle Tom's jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly as Patrick's toast veered further into dangerous territory. "But life," Patrick continued, raising his glass higher, "has a way of testing our faith. And sometimes, when we lose someone irreplaceable, we have to trust that their legacy will continue through others." His gaze locked onto Emma with an intensity that made her feel pinned to her chair like a butterfly in a display case. "Emma has that same gift, that same calling, and while nothing can replace what we lost." The words hung in the air like a blade suspended over silk. Emma could feel the exact moment when her father's carefully constructed toast began to crumble, could see the wine and grief and 5 years of unprocessed emotion converging into something that would crack their family's foundation beyond repair. "While nothing can replace Michael," Patrick said again, his voice growing thick with something that might have been tears, or might have been rage, "at least we can take comfort in knowing that his dreams will live on through Emma. At least we have." He paused, his eyes growing distant as if he were seeing something the rest of them couldn't. At least we have one child who might actually make us proud. The silence that followed was complete and terrible. Emma felt the words hit her chest like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping in the wreckage of her father's honesty. Around the table, faces that had been warm with celebration now reflected shock, embarrassment, the kind of social mortification that comes from witnessing something that should have remained private. "Patrick," Carol whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of decades of marriage and mediation. But Patrick wasn't finished. The dam had broken, and 5 years of careful emotional control was flooding out in words that could never be taken back. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked, his voice rising slightly as he looked around the room. "To lose your son? Your brilliant, compassionate, perfect son, who could have saved lives and changed the world? Do you know what it's like to have that future ripped away and be left with?" He gestured toward Emma, and the incomplete sentence hung in the air like a curse. Left with the consolation prize, left with the daughter who would never measure up, left with Emma. "I wish—" Patrick's voice cracked completely now, tears running down his cheeks as he raised his wineglass in what no longer resembled a toast. "I wish Michael was here instead of— Christ, I wish he was here instead. He would have actually made something of himself. He would have made us proud instead of just adequate." The wineglass slipped from Emma's fingers, the crystal shattering against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood, seeping into the fabric of Carol's careful preparations and staining everything it touched. Emma stood up so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor, the harsh sound breaking whatever spell had held the room in suspended animation. Faces turned toward her, some sympathetic, some embarrassed, all of them witnessing the moment when her father's grief finally overwhelmed his love for his living child. "Emma!" Sam started to stand, but she was already moving. "No," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, hollow and distant as if it were coming from underwater. "No, it's fine. It's good to finally hear the truth." She looked directly at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. This was the man who had shaped every major decision she'd made since she was 17 years old, whose approval she'd chased through 4 years of academic excellence in a field that had never felt like home. This was the father whose love she'd tried so desperately to earn that she'd nearly erased herself in the process. "I'm sorry I'm not Michael," Emma said, her words cutting through the terrible silence like a blade. "I'm sorry I survived when he didn't. I'm sorry my achievements feel adequate instead of extraordinary. But mostly, Dad, I'm sorry I wasted so much time trying to become someone I could never be." The room erupted into movement then. Guests, reaching for purses and jackets, mumbling excuses and promises to call later, the kind of rapid evacuation that happens when private family business explodes into public space. Emma watched them go with a detached fascination, noting how quickly celebration could transform into crisis, how easily years of careful social construction could collapse in the space of a few honest sentences. Uncle Tom moved first among the family members, crossing to Patrick with the measured steps of someone trained to navigate emotional emergencies. "That's enough," he said quietly, his therapist's voice cutting through Patrick's continued breakdown. "Patrick, that's enough." Grandma Sullivan stood slowly, her blue eyes blazing with something that might have been fury, or might have been heartbreak. She looked at her son with an expression Emma had never seen before, disappointment so profound it seemed to age her in real time. 40 years, the old woman said, her voice carrying across the chaos with startling clarity. 40 years I've watched this family, and I've never been more ashamed of the Sullivan name than I am right now. Carol was crying now. Quiet tears that she tried to hide behind her hands as she surveyed the wreckage of her carefully planned celebration. The dining room looked like a war zone. Overturned chairs, abandoned plates, wine spreading across everything, in dark stains that would never fully come out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma stood in the center of it all, feeling strangely calm in the eye of the storm her father had created. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of expectation was gone, replaced by something that might have been grief or might have been relief. The truth, however ugly, was finally out in the open. She was not Michael. She would never be Michael, and her father would never love her the way he'd loved his son. The knowledge should have destroyed her. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing that had happened in their house since Michael's funeral. "I'm going upstairs," Emma announced to no one in particular. "Sam, you should probably go home." But as she turned toward the staircase, she caught sight of Uncle Tom's expression, a mixture of professional concern and personal anguish that suggested this moment had been building for years. He knew something, she realized. About Michael, about their family, about the careful mythology they'd constructed to survive their grief. And for the first time since her father's devastating honesty had shattered the evening beyond repair, Emma felt something that might have been hope. If Uncle Tom knew the truth about Michael, if there were secrets that had been kept to preserve Patrick's idealized memory of his son, then maybe Emma's entire understanding of her family's dynamic was built on the same foundation of lies as tonight's celebration. Maybe the brother she'd been trying to live up to hadn't been perfect after all. Maybe there was more to Michael's story than anyone had been willing to tell her. The thought followed her up the stairs as the sounds of family crisis continued. Below, a small seed of possibility in the wreckage of the worst night of her life. Tomorrow, she would start asking questions that should have been asked years ago. Tonight, she would sit in her childhood bedroom and finally allow herself to grieve. Not just for Michael, but for the version of herself that had died in service to someone else's dreams. The business card from Dr. Vasquez felt like a lifeline. In her purse, a reminder that there were other paths forward, other ways to define success and meaning. For the first time in her adult life, Emma Sullivan was free to disappoint her father's expectations. And that freedom, however terrifying, felt like the first real gift she'd given herself in years. Emma's childhood bedroom felt smaller than she remembered, the walls closing in around her like the inside of a jewelry box that had once held precious things, but now contained only echoes of who she used to be. She sat on the edge of her twin bed, still wearing her graduation dress, staring at the academic achievement certificates that lined her walls like evidence in a case she no longer wanted to win. The sounds of crisis management drifted up from downstairs. Uncle Tom's measured voice attempting to calm Patrick, Carol's tearful apologies to departing guests, the clink of broken crystal being swept into a dustpan. Emma had expected the aftermath to hurt more, but instead she felt hollow, as if her father's words had scooped out something essential and left her empty but strangely lighter. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Em? It's me." Sam's voice carried the careful gentleness he'd perfected during his training in crisis intervention, the tone that told her he was approaching this conversation with his professional as well as his personal toolkit engaged. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that he should go home to his own family celebration. But the lie felt too heavy for her mouth. "Come in." Sam entered slowly, taking in the scene with a trained observation that would serve him well in his future career. Emma's room was a shrine to academic achievement. Honor roll certificates from high school, Dean's List recognition from every semester at Northwestern, the summa cum laude cord draped over her desk chair like a discarded costume. But there were other details too. The environmental science textbooks she'd bought but never officially enrolled for, hidden behind her required biomedical texts like guilty secrets. "Your dad's lost his mind," Sam said, without preamble, settling onto the floor with his back against her dresser. "I mean, I knew he was emotionally constipated, but that was next-level cruel." Emma almost smiled at his bluntness. Sam's family dynamics were so different from hers. Loud, affectionate arguments that resolved in fierce hugs, emotions that were expressed instead of buried, love that was messy but never conditional. She'd spent countless evenings at the Rivera household, watching in fascination as Sam's parents navigated disagreements with honesty instead of silence. "He finally told the truth," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I should be grateful." "Emma, no." Sam's voice sharpened with the authority that came from watching his own brother struggle with addiction, from learning too young that sometimes the people you love most are the ones most capable of destroying you. That wasn't truth. That was grief talking. And grief makes people say things that aren't really true even when they feel real. Emma pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller in the space that had never quite felt like hers. But it is true, isn't it? I'm not Michael. I never was, and I never will be. Never will. Every choice I've made for the past 5 years has been about trying to become someone I'm not. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they should cross. Sam studied her face with the intensity that had made him such a good student of human behavior, seeing past the careful composure she'd maintained throughout college to the exhaustion underneath. "Tell me about Michael," he said quietly. "Not the perfect version your parents talk about. Tell me about your brother." Emma was quiet for so long that Sam wondered if she'd heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the distant quality of someone accessing memories that had been carefully archived to avoid regular handling. "He was complicated," she began, her eyes focusing on something beyond the window where the suburban evening was settling into darkness. "Everyone remembers him as this golden boy, but he wasn't always happy. Even when we were kids, he had these dark moods where he'd disappear into his room for days. Mom called them thinking spells." She paused, gathering threads of memory that had been overshadowed by the mythology of Michael's perfection. He was brilliant. That part's true. But he was also anxious all the time. He used to have panic attacks before big tests, even though he always aced them. I remember finding him in the bathroom once, hyperventilating before his SATs. But by the time he got home, he'd joke about how easy they were. Sam nodded, recognizing the pattern of high-functioning anxiety that often went undiagnosed in academically successful students. "What was he like with you?" "Kind," Emma said immediately, and for the first time since her father's toast, her expression softened with genuine warmth. "He was 5 years older, but he never made me feel like a pest. He used to help me with math homework, and he'd explain things in ways that made sense instead of just giving me the answers." Her voice caught slightly. "He's the one who first got me interested in environmental science, actually. We did this project together when I was in middle school, building a solar oven for the science fair. He said someday we'd figure out how to power the whole world with clean energy." The revelation sat between them like a piece of a puzzle that had been hiding in plain sight. Sam could see the moment when Emma connected the dots, when she realized that her authentic interests weren't a betrayal of Michael's memory, but a continuation of something they'd shared. Sam said gently, "have you ever considered that maybe following your own path isn't dishonoring Michael? Maybe it's the opposite?" Before Emma could respond, another knock interrupted them. This one softer, more hesitant. "Emma, dear, it's Grandma." Emma exchanged glances with Sam, who nodded encouragingly. "Come in, Grandma." Patricia Sullivan entered with the measured dignity that had carried her through decades of family crises. But Emma could see the exhaustion around her eyes, the way her usually perfect posture had sagged slightly under the weight of the evening's revelations. "Samuel, would you mind giving Emma and me a few minutes alone?" Sam stood immediately, squeezing Emma's shoulder as he passed. "I'll be downstairs if you need me. And Em, we're going to figure this out, okay?" After he left, Grandma Sullivan settled into Emma's desk chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones carried the accumulated weight of 78 years. For a long moment, they sat in silence, grandmother and granddaughter connected by their shared disappointment in the man downstairs who had once been a boy Patricia had raised to be better than the words he'd spoken tonight. "Your father," Grandma Sullivan began, her voice carrying the tired authority of someone who had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and the loss of her husband, "is a fool, but he's a fool driven by pain. And pain makes people do terrible things to the people they love most." Emma studied her grandmother's face, seeing echoes of her own features in the older woman's bone structure. The stubborn chin, the intelligent eyes that missed very little. "Did you know he felt this way about me?" "I suspected," Grandma Sullivan admitted with the honesty that had made her both beloved and feared by her children. "Grief has a way of calcifying in some people. Your father never learned how to process losing Michael. So he turned your brother into a saint, and you into a reminder of what he lost. But why?" Emma's voice cracked with the question she'd been afraid to ask for 5 years. "Why wasn't I enough? Why couldn't he love me for who I am instead of resenting me for who I'm not?" Grandma Sullivan's expression softened with something that might have been heartbreak or might have been recognition. Because, darling, your father has never learned the difference between loving someone and loving the idea of someone. He loved the idea of Michael, the future doctor, the son who would carry on his legacy, the perfect child who reflected well on his parenting. But he never really knew Michael as a person. The words hit Emma like a revelation. What do you mean? Your brother was struggling, Emma. More than any of us realized at the time. More than your parents were willing to acknowledge even after we lost him. Grandma Sullivan's voice carried the weight of secrets that had been kept too long. Tom tried to tell your father, but Patrick wasn't ready to hear it. Sometimes I think he still isn't. Emma's heart began to race with the possibility that everything she thought she knew about her family's dynamics might be built on incomplete information. What kind of struggling? The kind that brilliant young people often face when they realize that intelligence isn't enough to guarantee happiness. The kind that happens when you're trying so hard to meet everyone else's expectations that you lose track of what you actually want for yourself. The parallel was so obvious that Emma wondered how she'd missed it for so long. You're saying Michael was like me? That he was living someone else's dreams too? I'm saying, Grandma Sullivan replied with the careful precision of someone who had learned to choose her words wisely, that the boy your father memorializes and the young man your brother actually was might have been two very different people. And maybe it's time you learned the truth about both of them. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of inadequacy that had lived there for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. If Michael hadn't been the perfect son her father remembered, if he'd struggled with the same pressure to live up to impossible expectations, then maybe Emma's own struggle wasn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of shared humanity. Grandma, she said quietly, what really happened to Michael? I mean, I know about the car accident, but what was happening before that? Why was he driving alone so late at night? Patricia Sullivan studied her granddaughter's face for a long moment, as if weighing the cost of truth against the price of continued silence. When she spoke, her voice carried the gravity of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade. That's a conversation you need to have with your Uncle Tom, she said finally. He was the only one Michael trusted with the whole truth. But Emma? She reached out to take her granddaughter's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. Whatever you learn about your brother, remember this. You are not responsible for carrying his dreams or fixing your father's grief. You are responsible for one life, and one life only. Your own. As Grandma Sullivan stood to leave, Emma felt the weight of possibility settling around her shoulders like a cloak. Tomorrow, she would seek out Uncle Tom and ask the questions that should have been asked years ago. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of separating her own identity from the mythology that had shaped her family's understanding of success and failure. But tonight, for the first time since Michael's funeral, Emma Sullivan allowed herself to imagine a future that belonged entirely to her. Messy and uncertain and authentic in all the ways that her academic achievements had never been. The business card from Dr. Vasquez felt like a key in her purse, and for the first time in years, Emma was ready to find out what door it might unlock. The sounds from downstairs had quieted to murmurs, the crisis moving into the damage assessment phase that would dominate her family's dynamics for days to come. But Emma no longer felt like a passive participant in their dysfunction. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of untangling herself from the expectations that had nearly suffocated her authentic self. Tonight, she would mourn not just for Michael, but for the version of herself that had died in service to someone else's dreams. And in the morning, she would begin the harder work of learning who Emma Sullivan really was when she wasn't trying to be anyone else. The Sullivan house felt different in the small hours after midnight, as if the evening's catastrophic honesty had shifted something fundamental in its foundation. Emma lay awake in her childhood bed, listening to the sounds of a family in crisis, hushed conversations that carried through heating vents, the creak of floorboards as people moved through rooms that suddenly felt too small to contain their accumulated grief and resentment. She'd heard Sam leave around 11, his car starting with the reliable rumble that had become the soundtrack to their college friendship. Before going, he'd knocked softly on her door to promise he'd call tomorrow, his voice carrying the kind of fierce loyalty that had sustained her through 4 years of academic pressure and family expectations. Emma had wanted to tell him about her conversation with Grandma Sullivan, about the possibility that Michael's story contained secrets that might change everything. But the words felt too fragile to speak aloud yet. Now, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Emma could hear voices drifting up from the kitchen, Uncle Tom's measured tones mixing with her father's increasingly agitated responses. She recognized the cadence of a therapeutic intervention, the careful probing that Tom used in his practice to help families navigate crisis. But Patrick's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had built his identity on control and was watching that control crumble in real time. Emma slipped out of bed and moved to her bedroom door, opening it just wide enough to catch fragments of the conversation below. The heating vent in her room had always carried sound from the kitchen with surprising clarity, an architectural quirk that had allowed her to eavesdrop on her parents' conversations throughout her adolescence. "Can't keep pretending this is healthy, Patrick. What you said to Emma tonight was unforgivable. Don't lecture me about my daughter." Patrick's voice carried the brittle authority of someone whose world had tilted too far off its axis. "You don't understand what it's like to lose. I understand exactly what it's like to lose someone you love. But I also understand the difference between grieving a person and worshipping a memory." There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that precedes either breakthrough or breakdown. When Patrick spoke again, his voice had dropped to something that might have been pain, or might have been rage. "He was perfect, Tom. Michael was everything I wanted to be as a father, everything I hoped to pass on to the next generation. He had purpose, direction, compassion. He was failing, Patrick." The words cut through the kitchen conversation, like a blade through silk, leaving behind a silence so complete that Emma wondered if she'd imagined them. She pressed closer to the heating vent, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for one of them to speak. "What did you say?" Patrick's voice was barely above a whisper. Michael was failing medical school. He'd been struggling for months before the accident, barely passing his classes, having panic attacks during clinical rotations. He called me 3 days before he died, crying so hard I could barely understand him. Emma gripped the doorframe to steady herself as Uncle Tom's words reshuffled everything she thought she knew about her brother's final months. The golden boy, the perfect student, the future cardiac surgeon. All of it built on foundations that were apparently made of sand. "That's not... He couldn't have been..." Patrick's voice fractured mid-sentence, as if the possibility was too enormous to fit inside his understanding of his son. He was going to drop out, Patrick. That's where he was driving the night he died. He was coming home to tell you and Carol that he couldn't do it anymore, that the pressure was killing him, that he wanted to study something else. Environmental science, actually. He'd already applied to transfer programs. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Environmental science. The same field that had called to her since that middle school science fair project. The same subject. She'd hidden like a guilty secret behind her biomedical engineering textbooks. Michael hadn't just shared her interest. He'd been planning to follow it when he died. She heard the scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor, followed by footsteps that suggested someone had stood up abruptly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Patrick's voice carried a note of devastation that Emma had never heard before. The sound of a man watching his most fundamental beliefs collapse. 5 years, Tom. 5 years I've been holding him up as this perfect example, and you let me... I tried to tell you at the funeral. I tried again at the 6-month mark and the 1-year anniversary. But you weren't ready to hear it, and Carol begged me not to push because she was afraid it would break you completely. Carol knew. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Emma could picture her uncle's face, the careful expression he wore when navigating particularly volatile family dynamics. She suspected. Michael had called her too, trying to work up the courage to tell you both. She was the one who suggested he talk to me first, get some professional advice on how to approach the conversation. Jesus Christ. Patrick's voice carried the weight of a man realizing that his understanding of the past 5 years had been built on incomplete information. All this time, I thought. I believed. You believed what you needed to believe to survive losing him. There's no shame in that, Patrick. But using that belief to punish Emma for not measuring up to a standard that never actually existed, that stops now. Emma heard movement in the kitchen, the sound of someone pacing, Or perhaps someone trying to process information that challenged every assumption they'd made about their family's tragedy. "She could have told me," Patrick said, his voice carrying a note of betrayal that made Emma's chest tighten. "Carol could have told me the truth. Would you have listened? Or would you have done what you always do when confronted with information that doesn't fit your narrative, shut down and refuse to engage?" The accuracy of Uncle Tom's assessment was devastating in its simplicity. Emma had watched her father employ the same defensive strategy countless times throughout her adolescence, particularly when discussions turned to therapy, grief counseling, or any form of emotional processing that required vulnerability. "I need to talk to Carol." Patrick's voice had shifted again, taking on the determined tone that Emma recognized from his business calls. "We need to figure out how to handle this." "What you need to figure out," Uncle Tom replied with the calm authority of someone accustomed to redirecting conversations toward healing rather than damage control, "is how to apologize to your daughter, not for Emma's sake, though she deserves it, but for your own. Because until you acknowledge what you did tonight, you're going to carry this guilt around like poison." Emma heard footsteps approaching the kitchen entrance, suggesting that someone was preparing to leave the conversation. She quickly retreated from her door, heart racing with the implications of what she'd overheard. Michael had been struggling. Michael had wanted to leave medical school. Michael had been interested in environmental science. Everything she'd believed about her family's expectations, about her brother's legacy, about her own inadequacy, had been built on a foundation of incomplete truth and well-intentioned deception. She was reaching for her phone to text Sam when another voice drifted up from downstairs, her mother's, carrying the careful modulation of someone who had been listening to the conversation and was now prepared to join it. "Tom's right, Patrick. We should have told you years ago. Carol." Patrick's voice carried surprise and something that might have been relief. "How long have you been?" "Long enough. And before you ask, yes. I knew about Michael's struggles. I knew about his plans to change majors, about the phone calls to Tom, about his decision to drop out. I knew, and I chose not to tell you because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you'd blame yourself. Afraid you'd realize that all the pressure we put on him to be perfect, to carry on your legacy, to be the son you dreamed of. Afraid you'd realize that we might have contributed to his depression." The admission hung in the kitchen air like a chemical reaction, transforming the family's understanding of their shared history. Emma felt something inside her chest crack open, not with pain, but with a strange kind of relief. Her mother had been carrying the same burden of protective silence that had shaped Emma's own relationship with truth and authenticity. "We killed him." Patrick's voice was so quiet that Emma had to strain to hear it. "Our expectations, our pressure, our complete inability to see him as anything other than an extension of our own dreams. We killed our son." "No," Carol said firmly. And Emma could hear the strength that her mother usually kept hidden beneath her diplomatic facade. "Depression killed our son. Mental illness that none of us recognized or knew how to address. But the pressure we put on him certainly didn't help, and the mythology we've created since his death has been damaging Emma in ways we never allowed ourselves to acknowledge." Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of years of family dysfunction shifting and reshaping itself around this new understanding. Her parents hadn't been maliciously withholding information. They'd been trying to protect themselves and each other from guilt that felt too enormous to bear. But in doing so, they'd created an impossible standard that had nearly consumed their surviving child. "What do we do now?" Patrick asked, his voice carrying the lost quality of someone whose navigational system had suddenly stopped working. "Now," Uncle Tom said with the gentle authority that had made him such an effective therapist. "You start telling the truth. To Emma, to yourselves, to anyone who'll listen. You start grieving the son you actually lost instead of the saint you created. And you start seeing the daughter you still have as a person in her own right, not as a replacement for someone else." As the conversation continued below, Emma found herself thinking about Dr. Vasquez's business card, still tucked in her purse like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. For the first time since graduation, the idea of choosing her own path felt less like a betrayal and more like a continuation of something Michael had been trying to do before his death. Tomorrow she would call Dr. Vasquez. Tomorrow she would begin the conversation with her parents that should have happened years ago. Tomorrow, she would start the process of building a life based on her own interests and values rather than her family's incomplete understanding of the past. But tonight, Emma Sullivan lay in her childhood bed and listened to her family begin the difficult work of excavating truth from the mythology that had shaped their grief. For the first time in 5 years, she felt like she might finally be ready to disappoint their expectations in service of something more valuable, her own authentic future. The cracks in their family's foundation were finally showing, but Emma no longer feared that everything would collapse. Sometimes, she realized, buildings needed to be demolished before they could be rebuilt on stronger ground. Emma woke before dawn with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows sleepless nights of revelation. The house around her was finally quiet, the crisis conversations having ended sometime after 3 in the morning with what sounded like her parents retreating to separate bedrooms, a development that might have worried her yesterday, but now felt like a necessary part of their family's long overdue reckoning with reality. She dressed quickly in jeans and a northwestern sweatshirt, moving with the purposeful energy of someone who had finally found a direction forward. The fragments of conversation she'd overheard last night had shifted her understanding of Michael's final months, but she needed more than second-hand accounts filtered through Uncle Tom's professional discretion. She needed to see the evidence for herself. Michael's room had been preserved exactly as he'd left it when he went back to medical school for what turned out to be his final semester, a shrine to the golden boy mythology that had shaped Emma's understanding of achievement and worth. But now, armed with the knowledge that her brother had been struggling, failing, planning to drop out, Emma approached the space with the investigative mindset that 4 years of scientific training had instilled in her. The room felt different in the gray pre-dawn light, less like a monument and more like a crime scene where the victim was authenticity itself. Emma moved systematically through Michael's belongings, looking for evidence of the depression and academic failure that Uncle Tom had described. The surface layer revealed nothing. Medical textbooks arranged with military precision, awards and certificates displayed with the same careful attention to presentation that characterized the rest of the Sullivan household. But Emma had learned during her research projects that the most important information was often hidden beneath the obvious. She started with Michael's desk, checking drawers that her parents had probably never opened, looking for the private thoughts that people keep separate from their public achievements. In the bottom drawer, wedged behind a stack of old birthday cards, she found a notebook that made her heart stop. The cover was unremarkable, black composition book, the kind used in high school chemistry classes. But the contents revealed a version of Michael that Emma had never known existed. The first entry was dated 3 months before his death. Can't sleep again. Had another panic attack during clinical rounds today. Dr. Morrison asked if I was feeling all right and I just nodded and smiled like everything was fine. Everything is not fine. I'm failing pathophysiology, barely passing anatomy, and I spend more time in the bathroom hyperventilating than I do actually learning anything useful. Mom called tonight to ask how classes were going, and I told her everything was great. Why? Can't I tell them the truth? Why does admitting failure feel worse than actually failing? Emma's hands trembled as she read her brother's words, recognizing her own patterns of perfectionism and people-pleasing reflected in his desperate attempts to maintain the facade of success. She'd spent 4 years performing academic excellence, while feeling hollow inside. But at least she'd never faced the additional pressure of clinical work that could literally determine whether patients lived or died. She flipped through more entries, each one revealing the growing weight of expectations that had been crushing Michael's authentic self. Dad came to visit last week and spent the entire time talking about how proud he is, how I'm going to revolutionize cardiac surgery, how I'm everything he'd hoped I'd be as a son. I wanted to tell him that I dream about environmental science the way he dreams about medical breakthroughs. I wanted to explain that every time I'm in the OR, I feel like I'm betraying some essential part of myself. But he was so happy, so convinced, that this is my calling. How do you tell someone you love that their dreams for you are killing you from the inside? The entry was accompanied by sketches in the margins, not anatomical diagrams, but designs for solar panels and wind turbines, the kind of sustainable technology that Michael had first introduced Emma to during their middle school science project. Her brother had been an artist as well as a scientist, but he'd hidden that creativity behind the rigid expectations of medical training. Emma found more evidence as she continued searching. Printouts of environmental science programs that Michael had researched, including detailed information about Northwestern's Renewable Energy Research Lab. Dr. Vasquez's name appeared multiple times in Michael's notes, along with course descriptions and research opportunities that aligned perfectly with Emma's own suppressed interests. But the most devastating discovery came in the form of a letter that Michael had written but never sent. Tucked between the pages of a medical ethics textbook, like a bookmark marking a decision he'd never gotten to make. Dear Mom and Dad, I know, this letter will disappoint you more than anything I've ever done, but I can't continue living a lie. I'm leaving medical school. Not because I'm not smart enough or dedicated enough, but because I finally realized that being good at something doesn't mean it's what you're supposed to do with your life. I've been accepted to Northwestern's environmental engineering program for next fall. I want to work on renewable energy systems, on technologies that might actually help solve climate change, instead of just treating the symptoms of a world that's literally burning around us. I know this isn't what you planned for me, and I know Dad will see it as a waste of my potential, but I can't keep trying to become someone I'm not. I love you both, but I need to love myself too. And that means following my own path, even if it leads away from everything you hoped I'd become. Your son, Michael P.S. I hope someday Emma will have the courage to disappoint you in service of her own dreams. She's brilliant in ways that have nothing to do with medicine, and I hope she figures that out before she wastes as much time as I have trying to be perfect. Emma sank onto Michael's bed, the letter clutched in her hands as tears she'd been holding back for years finally broke free. Her brother had seen her authentic self even when she couldn't see it herself. He'd recognized her passion for environmental science and had hoped she'd find the courage to pursue it, even if it meant disappointing their parents' expectations. The postscript felt like a message from beyond the grave, a brother's blessing, for the choice she'd been too afraid to make. Michael had been planning to transfer to the same program that Dr. Vasquez now represented, the path that Emma had been afraid to follow, because it felt like betraying his memory. But following that path wouldn't be a betrayal, it would be a completion. She photographed the letter and the most revealing journal entries with her phone, evidence that would help her family finally grieve the brother they'd actually lost instead of the saint they'd created. But she also found herself taking pictures of Michael's sketches, his research notes on sustainable technology, his dreams for a future that would never happen, but that she might still be able to fulfill. By the time the sun was fully up, Emma had transformed her understanding of her family's tragedy. Michael hadn't been the perfect son who died tragically young. He'd been a young man struggling with depression and authenticity, trying to find the courage to live on his own terms when mental illness and a tragic accident had cut his journey short. The revelation should have made his death feel even more senseless, but instead, Emma felt something that might have been peace. Her brother had been human, flawed, uncertain about his future in all the same ways that she'd been uncertain about hers. The impossible standard she'd been trying to meet existed only in her parents' imagination, built from grief and guilt and the very human need to make sense of senseless loss. She was returning Michael's journal to its hiding place when she heard movement downstairs, the sound of coffee being made, and morning routines beginning despite the previous night's emotional devastation. Emma checked her phone and found 3 text messages from Sam, each one a variation on, "How are you holding up?" and "Call me when you're ready to talk." Instead of texting back, she scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Vasquez's number. The business card was still in her purse, but Emma no longer needed the physical reminder of the choice she was about to make. She'd found something better, her brother's blessing, and the knowledge that authenticity wasn't a betrayal of family or legacy, but a continuation of it. The phone rang twice before Dr. Vasquez answered, her voice carrying the slight accent that had always made Emma feel like she was being invited into a conversation rather than interrogated about her academic performance. "Emma? This is a pleasant surprise. How are you feeling after yesterday's ceremony?" "Different," Emma said, the understatement carrying more weight than she'd intended. "Dr. Vasquez, that research position you mentioned, is it still available?" There was a pause that might have been surprise or might have been satisfaction. "Of course. Though I have to ask, what changed your mind? Yesterday you seemed quite committed to the pre-medical track." Emma looked around Michael's room one final time, taking in the evidence of a life that had been cut short before its authentic chapter could begin. "I found out that the person I've been trying to live up to was actually trying to become someone more like who I really am. It turns out that disappointing my family's expectations might be the most honest thing I can do. That, Dr. Vasquez said with warmth that carried across the phone line like a hug. Sounds like the beginning of real wisdom. Why don't you come in Monday morning and we can discuss the details? I think you're going to find that following your authentic path leads to much more interesting destinations than the one someone else mapped out for you. As Emma ended the call, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not the hollow emptiness that had characterized her graduation day, but a sense of expansion, of possibility finally allowed to breathe. She'd spent 5 years trying to honor Michael's memory by becoming someone she wasn't, only to discover that the best way to honor him was to find the courage he'd been seeking when he died. The conversation with her parents would be difficult. The process of rebuilding their family's understanding of success and legacy would take time. But for the first time since Michael's funeral, Emma Sullivan felt like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. She was finally ready to disappoint her way into authenticity, armed with the knowledge that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to become the person they think they need you to be. Emma found her parents in the kitchen, sitting at opposite ends of the breakfast table like opponents in a chess match, where neither player was sure of the rules anymore. Patrick's usually immaculate appearance showed the wear of a sleepless night. His hair uncombed, his Northwestern alumni t-shirt wrinkled, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone whose fundamental beliefs had been demolished. Carol moved around the kitchen with the mechanical precision of someone using routine to avoid conversation, brewing coffee and arranging pastries that no one would eat. The morning light streaming through the windows felt harsh after the emotional darkness of the previous evening, illuminating all the careful facades that had finally cracked beyond repair. Emma stood in the doorway for a moment, clutching the printed pages from Michael's journal and the letter he'd never sent, gathering courage for a conversation that would either heal their family or destroy what remained of their carefully constructed mythology. "Good morning," she said, her voice cutting through the kitchen's tense silence like a stone dropped into still water. Both parents looked up with the startled expression of people who had been caught in the middle of their own private reckonings. Patrick's face immediately shifted into what Emma recognized as his crisis management mode. The professional composure he wore during difficult board meetings or challenging business negotiations. "Emma, sweetheart, about last night?" "Before you say anything," Emma interrupted, settling into her usual chair at the table and placing Michael's journal where all three of them could see it. "I think we need to talk about Michael, the real Michael. Not the version we've been pretending existed for the past 5 years." Carol's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, her eyes focusing on the composition notebook with the kind of recognition that suggested she'd seen it before. Patrick's professional composure faltered as he realized that his daughter was holding evidence of secrets he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. "Emma," Carol said carefully, "where did you find that?" "In Michael's room, along with this." Emma placed the unsent letter next to the journal, watching as her parents' faces reflected the same devastation she'd felt upon reading her brother's words. He was going to drop out of medical school, wasn't he? He was planning to study environmental science instead. The silence that followed was complete and terrible, broken only by the sound of the coffee maker finishing its cycle and the distant hum of suburban morning traffic. Emma watched her parents grapple with the evidence of their son's authentic struggles, seeing the moment when denial became impossible. Patrick reached for the letter with trembling hands, his eyes scanning Michael's words with the desperate intensity of someone hoping the text might change if he read it carefully enough. When he finished, he set the paper down as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I don't understand," he said, his voice carrying the lost quality of someone whose navigational system had stopped working. He was brilliant. He was top of his class in high school, scored in the 99th percentile on the MCAT. Medical school was supposed to be his calling. "It was your calling," Emma said, her words gentle but uncompromising. "Michael was trying to live up to your dreams for him, just like I've been trying to live up to your dreams for me. But dreams that belong to someone else will eventually suffocate the person trying to fulfill them." Carol set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone whose hands were no longer entirely steady. "We knew he was struggling," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The phone calls home became less frequent, and when he did call, he sounded distant, tired. But we thought it was just the normal stress of medical school. Normal stress doesn't drive someone to write suicide notes in the margins of their textbooks, Emma said, opening the journal to a page she'd photographed, but hadn't shared with her parents yet. Look at this entry from 2 weeks before he died. Patrick leaned forward to read his son's handwriting, his face growing pale as he processed Michael's words. Sometimes I think about what would happen if I just drove off a bridge instead of coming home to tell them I'm a failure. Would that be easier for everyone? Would they rather have a dead son they could be proud of than a living son who disappointed them? Oh God, Carol whispered, her hand flying to her mouth as the implications of Michael's mental state became undeniable. He was thinking about. We could have lost him even if there hadn't been an accident. Emma watched her parents grapple with the reality that their son's death might not have been the random tragedy they'd believed it to be, that the pressure they'd applied might have contributed to a mental health crisis that could have ended in suicide, regardless of the car accident that actually claimed his life. The night he died, Emma continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the revelations. He wasn't just driving home from medical school. He was driving home to tell you that he was leaving medicine to study environmental science. Uncle Tom says Michael had already been accepted to Northwestern's renewable energy research program. Patrick's face crumpled with something that might have been grief or might have been guilt. The same program that your Dr. Vasquez runs. The one you've been hiding your interest in since freshman year. The accuracy of her father's observation surprised Emma, suggesting that Patrick had been more aware of her authentic interests than she'd realized. You knew? I knew you lit up when you talked about environmental issues in ways you never did when discussing medical school, Patrick admitted, his voice carrying the weight of a man realizing that his blindness had been willful rather than accidental. I knew you checked out books on renewable energy systems and hid them behind your biomedical engineering textbooks. I knew, and I chose to ignore it because I needed at least one of my children to fulfill the dreams I'd built my identity around. The admission hung in the kitchen air like a chemical reaction, transforming the emotional atmosphere from defensive positioning to something that might eventually become understanding. Emma felt the walls she'd built around her resentment beginning to crack, replaced by something more complicated than anger. Grief for the years they'd all lost to mythology and expectation. Dad, she said quietly. I called Dr. Vasquez this morning. I'm going to accept the research position in her renewable energy lab. Carol's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the devastated tears Emma had expected. Instead, her mother's expression carried something that might have been relief, or might have been pride. Thank God, Carol whispered. I've been watching you suffocate for 4 years, trying to become someone you're not, and I didn't know how to tell you it was okay to disappoint us. Patrick stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the backyard where Michael had once built solar ovens and wind-powered generators for middle school science projects. His shoulders shook with what Emma realized were sobs, the first tears she'd seen her father shed since Michael's funeral. I killed him, Patrick said, his voice muffled by grief and self-recrimination. My expectations, my pressure, my complete inability to see him as anything other than an extension of my own unfulfilled dreams, I killed my son. No, Emma said firmly, standing to face her father with the authority that 4 years of scientific training had given her. Depression killed Michael, mental illness that none of us recognized or knew how to address. But the pressure we put on him to be perfect certainly didn't help, and the mythology we've created since his death has been damaging all of us in ways we're only beginning to understand. She moved to stand beside her father at the window, looking out at the yard where she and Michael had once dreamed of powering the world with clean energy. But we can honor his memory in a different way now. We can stop trying to preserve the perfect son who never actually existed and start grieving the complicated, brilliant, struggling young man who did. Patrick turned to face his daughter, his eyes red with tears but clearer than Emma had seen them in years. I don't know how to be your father without trying to shape you into someone you're not. I don't know how to love you without expecting you to fulfill my dreams. Then learn, Emma said simply. Learn to see me as I am instead of as you think I should be. Learn to love my authentic choices even when they disappoint your expectations. Learn to grieve Michael's real struggles instead of mourning a saint who never existed. Carol joined them at the window, her presence creating a triangle of shared grief and tentative hope. "Can you forgive us?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of 5 years of emotional neglect and misplaced expectations. "Can you forgive us for not seeing you clearly? For making you feel like you had to earn our love by becoming someone you're not?" Emma looked at her parents, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in years, and saw not the demanding figures who had shaped her academic choices, but two people who had been drowning in their own grief and hadn't known how to love their surviving child without trying to resurrect their dead one. "I can forgive you," she said, her voice steady with the conviction that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, that healing did not require pretending that damage hadn't been done. "But I need you to forgive yourselves too. I need you to stop carrying guilt that's preventing you from building authentic relationships with the people who are still here." Patrick reached out tentatively, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to touch his daughter anymore. When Emma stepped into his embrace, she felt something that had been frozen between them for 5 years finally begin to thaw. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not completely, but it was the beginning of the possibility that they might eventually learn to love each other as they actually were rather than as they thought they should be. "I'm going to start therapy," Patrick said into her hair, his voice muffled but determined. "Tom's been telling me for years that I need professional help processing Michael's death, and I think I'm finally ready to listen." "We both are," Carol added, her hand finding Emma's shoulder in a gesture that felt like benediction. "We're going to learn how to be your parents instead of trying to make you into someone else's child." As they stood together in the morning light, surrounded by the evidence of Michael's authentic struggles and dreams, Emma felt something shift. In her family's foundation, not the collapse she'd feared, but a reconstruction based on truth rather than mythology. They would never be the same family they'd been before last night's devastating honesty. But perhaps they could become something better. A family that valued authenticity over achievement, love over expectation, truth over the comfortable lies that had nearly destroyed them all. The business card from Dr. Vasquez no longer felt like a betrayal hidden in her purse. It felt like a bridge toward a future that honored both her own dreams and her brother's interrupted journey toward authenticity. For the first time in 5 years, Emma Sullivan was ready to disappoint her family's expectations in service of something more valuable: the courage to live as herself rather than as someone else's unfulfilled dreams. The phone call came Monday morning as Emma sat in her car outside Northwestern's Technological Institute, watching early summer rain streak the windshield, while she gathered courage for the conversation that would officially redirect her life. She'd spent the weekend in a strange, liminal space between her old identity and whatever came next, helping her parents begin the difficult work of sorting through Michael's belongings with honest eyes instead of grief-clouded reverence. They'd found more evidence of his authentic interests: sketches for sustainable housing designs, research papers on solar energy efficiency that he'd written for personal interest rather than academic credit, even a partially completed application to volunteer with an environmental nonprofit that worked on renewable energy projects in developing countries. Each discovery had peeled back another layer of the mythology they'd constructed around his memory, revealing a young man who had been far more complex and uncertain than the saint their grief had created. "Dr. Vasquez?" Emma answered, recognizing the number from the business card that had become a talisman in her purse. "Emma, good morning. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, but I wanted to follow up on our conversation Friday. Are you free to meet this afternoon? I'd like to show you the lab and discuss the research project in more detail." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs with something that felt like anticipation rather than anxiety, a sensation so unfamiliar after 4 years of academic performance driven by obligation that she had to pause to identify it. "I'd love that. What time works for you?" 2 o'clock? Building B12, 3rd floor. And Emma? Dr. Vasquez's voice carried a warmth that suggested she understood the significance of the choice Emma was making. "Bring questions. Real ones, not the kind you think you should ask. This conversation is about figuring out if this path truly calls to you, not about impressing anyone with your qualifications." After hanging up, Emma sat in her car for several more minutes, watching Northwestern. Students hurry between buildings under umbrellas and rain jackets. Some of them were probably heading to pre-med courses, pursuing the path she'd abandoned. Others might be environmental science majors, studying the field she'd been afraid to enter. the campus that had felt like a stage for performing someone else's dreams now looked like a place where authentic learning might actually happen. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sam. "How's the family apocalypse recovery going? Need backup?" Emma smiled, typing back. "Meeting with Dr. Vasquez this afternoon, officially switching to environmental science." The response came immediately. "Finally. Your dad recover from his nervous breakdown yet?" "Working on it. Family therapy starts Thursday." "Look at you. Disappointing people left and right. I'm so proud." Sam's irreverent support felt like oxygen after years of holding her breath. She'd spent the weekend explaining her decision to various family members and friends, each conversation requiring her to defend choices that felt increasingly natural the more she articulated them. Uncle Tom had been unsurprised but supportive, sharing stories about Michael's environmental interests that he'd never felt comfortable mentioning while Patrick was still mythologizing his son's medical aspirations. Grandma Sullivan had been characteristically direct. "About damn time you stopped trying to live someone else's life." The most surprising reaction had come from her father. After the initial devastation of learning about Michael's real struggles and plans, Patrick had shown a resilience that Emma hadn't expected. He'd spent Sunday afternoon researching Dr. Vasquez's work, reading papers on renewable energy systems with the same intensity he usually reserved for medical device patents. "Your mentor," he'd said over dinner Sunday night, "has published some fascinating research on photovoltaic efficiency improvements. Her work on perovskite solar cells could revolutionize the industry." He'd paused, studying Emma's face with an attention that felt different from his usual assessment of her academic performance. "I think I'd like to meet her sometime, if you're comfortable with that." The offer had surprised Emma with its implicit respect for her autonomy. Patrick was asking permission to engage with her chosen field, rather than trying to control or redirect her interests. It was a small gesture, but it suggested that their family's catastrophic honesty might actually lead somewhere healthier than the mythology they'd been maintaining. By the time Emma reached Dr. Vasquez's lab that afternoon, she felt ready for questions that went beyond academic credentials or career prospects. She wanted to understand what it meant to dedicate your life to work that aligned with your values, to build a career around solving problems that genuinely mattered to you, rather than simply advancing through predetermined steps towards someone else's definition of success. The Renewable Energy Lab occupied an entire floor of the Technological Institute, with equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Solar panels arranged in testing configurations, batteries that could store enough energy to power homes, computer models that predicted energy efficiency with remarkable precision. Dr. Vasquez moved through the space with the confident ease of someone who had found her calling and spent decades pursuing it with passion rather than obligation. "Tell me what you see," Dr. Vasquez said as they toured the facility, her dark eyes studying Emma's reactions to the various research stations. Emma paused in front of a display showing different types of solar cell configurations, her mind immediately connecting the theoretical knowledge from her engineering courses with practical applications she'd only dreamed about. "I see possibilities," she said slowly. "Ways to make renewable energy more efficient, more accessible, more affordable for communities that need it most." "And what questions does that raise for you?" The question unlocked something in Emma's mind that had been constrained by years of studying for tests rather than pursuing genuine curiosity. How do we bridge the gap between laboratory efficiency and real-world implementation? How do we design systems that work in developing countries with limited infrastructure? How do we make renewable energy economically competitive with fossil fuels in regions where environmental concerns take a back seat to immediate survival needs? Dr. Vasquez smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had recognized authentic, intellectual passion. "Those are exactly the questions we're working on, and they're questions that require not just technical expertise, but understanding of economics, policy, social justice, international development, the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that comes naturally to people who see engineering as a tool for solving human problems rather than an end in itself." They settled in Dr. Vasquez's office, which was lined with books on subjects ranging from materials science to environmental policy to international development economics. The diversity of interests reflected the kind of intellectual curiosity that Emma had always felt but had never been encouraged to pursue in the focused trajectory of pre-medical education. I need to ask you something directly, Dr. Vasquez said, her expression growing more serious. Why are you really here? What changed between Friday, when you were committed to medical school, and today, when you're sitting in my lab asking about renewable energy research? Emma had prepared for this question. But sitting across from someone whose career represented everything she'd been afraid to want, the careful answers she'd rehearsed felt inadequate. Instead, she found herself telling the truth with a rawness that surprised them both. I found out that the person I've been trying to become, my brother Michael, who died 5 years ago, was actually trying to become someone more like who I really am. He was planning to leave medical school to study environmental science when he died. I've been chasing his ghost, trying to fulfill dreams that were never really his, but were what my parents needed him to represent after they lost him. Dr. Vasquez leaned back in her chair, her expression reflecting the kind of understanding that comes from personal experience with family expectations and authentic calling. And now? Now I want to honor his memory by having the courage he was working toward when he died. The courage to disappoint other people's expectations in service of work that genuinely matters to me. What matters to you about this work? Emma looked out the window at the campus where she'd spent 4 years performing academic excellence without ever feeling truly engaged. Climate change is the defining challenge of our generation. Everything else we accomplish will be meaningless if we can't figure out how to transition to sustainable energy systems before environmental collapse makes civilization impossible. I want to be part of solving that problem, not just treating the symptoms of a world that's burning around us. And the personal cost? Disappointing your family? Starting over in a new field? Admitting that 4 years of biomedical engineering was time spent pursuing someone else's dreams? Emma considered the question carefully, thinking about the weekend she'd spent watching her parents begin to grieve the son they'd actually lost instead of the saint they'd created. The cost of continuing to live someone else's life is higher than the cost of disappointing people who love an idealized version of me more than they love who I actually am. And I hope, that my parents are finally ready to learn how to love me as I am, rather than as they think I should be. Dr. Vasquez nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had heard the kind of self-awareness that predicted success in graduate research. The position I mentioned is part of a larger project focused on developing renewable energy systems for rural communities in Central America. We're working with local organizations to design solar and wind power installations that can provide reliable electricity to villages that have never had consistent access to the grid. She pulled out a folder containing photographs and technical specifications that made Emma's pulse quicken with genuine excitement. The technical challenges are significant. Designing systems that can withstand extreme weather, that can be maintained by people without advanced engineering training, that can be manufactured and installed with limited resources. But the human impact of success would be enormous. We're talking about providing electricity for schools, clinics, water purification systems, economic opportunities that depend on reliable power. Emma studied the materials with the focused attention she'd never quite managed for her biomedical engineering coursework. These weren't abstract problems designed to test her knowledge of theoretical principles. They were real challenges that affected real people's lives in immediate and meaningful ways. The research would involve significant fieldwork, Dr. Vasquez continued. 6 months in the lab developing and testing systems, then 6 months in Guatemala working with communities to implement and evaluate the installations. It's not glamorous work. You'd be living in rural villages, dealing with language barriers, troubleshooting technical problems in conditions that make laboratory research look easy by comparison. It sounds perfect, Emma said, the words emerging with such immediate certainty that they surprised even her. When do I start? Dr. Vasquez laughed, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that Emma recognized as the hallmark of someone who had found work that aligned with her deepest values. Officially, the position starts in September, but if you're serious about making this transition, I'd recommend spending the summer getting up to speed on renewable energy systems, international development economics, and conversational Spanish. And Emma? She leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. This work will change you in ways you can't anticipate. You'll see poverty and environmental degradation up close. You'll work with communities that have been failed by government and corporate promises. You'll confront the reality that technical solutions alone aren't enough to address the intersection of energy access and social justice. Will it be worth it? That depends on what you mean by worth. If you mean will it lead to a traditional definition of career success, high salary, prestigious position, recognition from your field, maybe not. But if you mean, will it give you the chance to do work that genuinely matters? To use your skills to address problems that affect millions of people? To build a life around values rather than expectations? Dr. Vasquez smiled with the confidence of someone who had asked herself the same question decades ago and never regretted her answer. Yes, it will absolutely be worth it. Emma left the meeting with a stack of reading materials, contact information for language programs, and something she'd never felt after 4 years of academic achievement, genuine excitement about the work ahead of her. The transition wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be moments when she questioned whether she'd made the right choice. But for the first time since Michael's death, Emma felt like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. That evening, she called her parents to share the details of her conversation with Dr. Vasquez. Patrick listened with the careful attention he usually reserved for business presentations, asking technical questions that showed he'd been researching renewable energy systems with genuine interest rather than skeptical evaluation. The work she's describing, he said when Emma finished explaining the Guatemala project, sounds like exactly the kind of challenge Michael would have loved. Complicated technical problems with immediate human impact, interdisciplinary thinking, work that actually matters. He paused, and Emma could hear something in his voice that might have been pride, or might have been regret. I think I'm finally beginning to understand what we lost when we lost him, and what we almost lost when we tried to make you into someone you're not. Carol's response was more emotional but equally supportive. I want you to call me from Guatemala, she said, her voice thick with tears that seemed to combine grief for the years they'd lost with excitement for the future Emma was choosing. I want to hear about the communities you're working with, the problems you're solving, the person you're becoming when you're finally free to be yourself. As Emma hung up the phone, she realized that her family's catastrophic honesty had done more than just clear the air. It had created space for authentic relationships based on who they actually were rather than who they thought they should be. The road ahead would be challenging, both personally and professionally, but for the first time in her adult life, Emma Sullivan was walking it as herself, rather than as someone else's unfulfilled dreams. The business card from Dr. Vasquez no longer felt like a secret rebellion hidden in her purse. It felt like a key to a future that honored both her own authentic calling and her brother's interrupted journey toward the same kind of courage. Tomorrow, she would start the Spanish lessons that would prepare her for fieldwork in Guatemala. Tonight, she would allow herself to feel excited about work that mattered, grateful for a family that was finally learning to love her as she was, and proud of the courage it had taken to disappoint her way into authenticity. Emma stood in her childhood bedroom 3 weeks later, surrounded by boxes that represented the archaeology of someone else's dreams. Her biomedical engineering textbooks sat in neat stacks, their spines bearing the titles of courses she'd excelled in but never loved: organic chemistry, human physiology, medical ethics. 4 years of academic achievement reduced to knowledge she would probably never use again. Expensive books that would go to other students who might find genuine passion in the subjects that had felt like performance art to Emma. The morning, light streaming through her windows, fell across acceptance letters that had arrived throughout the week. Responses to medical school applications she'd never submitted, but which her father had apparently sent on her behalf during the months when he'd been more invested in her future than she was. Northwestern Medical School, where Michael had struggled and failed, had offered her early admission based on her academic record, and what they assumed was her family legacy in medicine. They don't know you never took the MCAT, Carol said from the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the kind of bemused expression that had become common in the Sullivan household since they'd started telling each other the truth. Your father's connections in the medical device industry apparently carry more weight than actual test scores. Emma looked up from the letter she'd been reading, an offer that would have fulfilled every expectation her family had held for her future, complete with a scholarship that would have covered tuition and living expenses for all 4 years of medical school. 6 months ago, receiving this letter would have felt like winning the lottery. Now it felt like being offered a prison sentence with excellent benefits. What did Dad say when you told him about the acceptance? He cried, Carol admitted, settling into Emma's desk chair with the careful movements of someone still learning how to navigate authentic emotions. Happy tears this time. He said it meant that you really could have succeeded in medicine if you'd wanted to. That choosing environmental science wasn't about running away from something difficult, but about running toward something meaningful. The distinction mattered more than Emma had expected. Part of her had worried that choosing Dr. Vasquez's research project was a form of academic cowardice, an escape from the rigorous demands of medical education into something easier or less prestigious. But seeing the medical school acceptance letter made clear that she wasn't fleeing failure. She was choosing alignment over achievement, authenticity over expectation. I keep thinking about what Michael wrote in that letter, Emma said, folding the Northwestern Medical School acceptance and placing it in the box with her other biomedical engineering materials. About hoping I'd have the courage to disappoint them in service of my own dreams. I don't think he meant courage to fail, but courage to succeed at something different from what everyone expected. Carol nodded, her eyes reflecting the kind of understanding that had emerged from their family's commitment to honesty rather than harmony. The past 3 weeks had been emotionally exhausting, as they'd all learned to navigate relationships based on authentic feelings rather than careful performance. Patrick had started therapy with Uncle Tom's guidance, confronting 5 years of grief and guilt with the methodical determination he usually reserved for business challenges. The process was messy and painful, but it was also creating space for genuine connection instead of the hollow interactions that had characterized their family since Michael's death. Your father wants to drive you to the airport tomorrow, Carol said, referencing Emma's upcoming trip to Guatemala for the preliminary fieldwork with Dr. Vasquez's research team. He's been reading about the communities you'll be working with, the challenges they face with energy access. I think he's finally beginning to understand that engineering can be about solving human problems instead of just advancing technology for its own sake. Emma felt a surge of affection for her father that surprised her with its intensity. Patrick's journey toward understanding hadn't been smooth or predictable, but his willingness to learn about her chosen field represented a kind of love that she'd been craving for years. Attention paid to who she actually was, rather than who he needed her to be. Has he talked to you about selling the medical device company? The question had been hovering around their family conversations for weeks. Patrick's business had been built on the assumption that Michael would eventually take over operations, bringing fresh medical perspective to the development of surgical instruments and diagnostic equipment. But with Michael gone and Emma pursuing renewable energy research, the company felt like a monument to dreams that would never be fulfilled. He's considering it, Carol said carefully. Tom thinks it might be healthy for him to step away from work that's so tied up with his expectations for Michael's future. But your father's not sure what he'd do with himself if he retired. Emma had been thinking about this problem during her Spanish lessons and renewable energy systems coursework, seeing parallels between her father's career crisis and the community development challenges she was preparing to address in Guatemala. Both involved people who had built their identities around systems that no longer served their authentic needs. What if he didn't retire? Emma asked, the idea forming as she spoke. What if he redirected the company toward renewable energy technology instead of medical devices? There's a huge market for sustainable energy systems, and the engineering principles are similar enough that he could transition the business instead of selling it. Carol's eyes widened with something that might have been surprise or might have been hope. Do you think he'd be interested in that? I think he'd be interested in any work that felt meaningful instead of just profitable. And I think he might like the idea of building something that could contribute to the same kind of problems I'll be working on in Guatemala. The conversation was interrupted by Patrick's voice calling from downstairs. Dinner was ready, and the family gathering, that had become a nightly ritual since their commitment to authentic communication was about to begin. These meals had replaced the careful performances of previous family dinners, with conversations that were often difficult, but always real. As they made their way to the kitchen, Emma reflected on how much had changed in the month since her graduation. Party disaster. The house felt different now, less like a museum preserving perfect memories, and more like a home where imperfect people were learning to love each other honestly. Michael's room had been transformed from a shrine into a study space where Patrick researched renewable energy systems and Emma practiced Spanish vocabulary. The change honored Michael's memory, while acknowledging that life had to move forward, in directions he would never see. Dinner conversations centered around Emma's departure for Guatemala the following morning, but the emotional weight was different from the anxiety that had characterized family discussions during her college years. Patrick asked technical questions about the solar installations she'd be helping design, showing genuine curiosity about challenges he was beginning to understand. Carol wanted details about the communities she'd be working with, having spent the afternoon researching Guatemalan culture and history with the thoroughness. Emma's field reports from Guatemala were informing the company's product development, creating a feedback loop between academic research and practical implementation that neither could achieve alone. Another message arrived. This one from Carol. Dr. Vasquez called to say your community impact assessment exceeded all expectations. She's recommending you for the advanced research track when you return. So proud of the work you're doing. Carol's support had been one of the most surprising developments of the past 6 months. After years of deferring to Patrick's judgment about family decisions, she'd begun asserting her own opinions and interests with growing confidence. She'd re-enrolled in the nursing program she'd abandoned 30 years ago, drawn by the same desire to contribute to meaningful work that had motivated Emma's career change. The family dynamics that had once been characterized by careful performance and emotional distance were slowly transforming into something messier, but more authentic. They argued now. Real disagreements about politics, career choices, and personal values. But the arguments were conducted by people who were genuinely interested in understanding each other rather than maintaining facades. Emma's final task in Santa Elena was to conduct exit interviews with community members who had participated in the solar installation project, gathering feedback that would inform future renewable energy initiatives. The conversations had revealed insights about community development that no amount of classroom education could have provided. The most important thing, explained Jorge Ramirez, a local electrician who had been trained to maintain the solar installation, was that you asked us what we needed instead of assuming you knew what was best for us. Too many development projects fail because outsiders design solutions for problems they don't understand. The observation encapsulated everything Emma had learned about the difference between imposing technical solutions and collaborating with communities to address challenges. They had identified themselves. The solar installation worked not just because the engineering was sound, but because it had been designed in partnership with people who understood their own needs and resources. That evening, Emma joined the village celebration that had been organized to mark the completion of the solar project. The community center glowed with LED lights powered by clean energy, filled with children completing homework, adults participating in literacy classes, and families gathering for social activities that had been impossible before reliable electricity. Traditional marimba music mixed with the quiet hum of computers that could now operate throughout the evening, creating a soundtrack for development that honored cultural traditions while embracing technological advancement. Doña Carmen stood to address the gathered community, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had shepherded her village through decades of challenges and improvements. 6 months ago, we welcomed Emma and her team with hope, but also with skepticism. We have seen too many projects that promised to help us, but ultimately served the needs of outsiders more than our own needs. She paused, her eyes finding Emma in the crowd with warmth that felt like familial affection. But this project was different. From the beginning, Emma and Dr. Vasquez insisted that we were partners, not beneficiaries. They learned our language, they listened to our concerns, they designed solutions that we could understand and maintain ourselves. The recognition felt more meaningful than any academic honor Emma had ever received. These were people whose lives had been directly improved by work she'd helped design and implement, whose evaluation of her contribution was based on practical impact rather than theoretical knowledge. The solar panels will provide electricity for many years, Doña Carmen continued. But the more important gift is the knowledge that we can solve our own problems when we have access to the right tools and education. Emma has taught our young people that engineering is not just about machines. It is about creating opportunities for communities to thrive. As the celebration continued into the evening, Emma found herself in conversation with Luis Morales, Doña Carmen's 19-year-old son, who had emerged as one of the most capable solar installation technicians despite having no previous electrical training. I want to study engineering, Luis told her in the careful English he'd been practicing since the project began. Not to leave Santa Elena, but to bring more technical knowledge back to communities like ours. Is that possible? Emma felt her heart expand with the possibility that her work might inspire the next generation of engineers to approach their field as a tool for community development, rather than simply individual advancement. It's absolutely possible. There are scholarship programs specifically designed for students who want to use engineering to address rural development challenges. She spent the next hour helping Luis research educational opportunities that would allow him to pursue engineering while maintaining connections to his community. The conversation reminded Emma of her own journey toward authentic career choices. The difference between education that served personal ambition and education that served deeper purposes. Later that evening, Emma called her parents from the village's newly equipped communications center, using internet connectivity that was possible because of the reliable electricity the solar installation provided. Patrick's face appeared on the video call with the kind of enthusiasm that Emma was still learning to recognize as genuine, rather than performative. The technical reports you sent are remarkable. The efficiency data could influence how we design community-scale installations for the company's next project. What's the next project? Emma asked, noting that her father now spoke about renewable energy work with the same passion he'd once reserved for medical device innovations. Rural electrification in Honduras. A partnership with local NGOs to provide solar power for schools and health clinics in communities that have never had access to the electrical grid. Patrick paused, his expression growing more serious. I've been thinking about what you said regarding sustainable development being about more than just technology. We're designing the Honduras project as a training initiative, teaching local technicians to install and maintain the systems themselves. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Patrick asking detailed questions about community engagement strategies and Emma sharing insights about the cultural considerations that affected technology adoption. It was the kind of collaborative, professional relationship she'd never imagined having with her father, based on shared interests rather than inherited expectations. Carol joined the call from her nursing school study group, her face bright with the satisfaction of someone who had rediscovered intellectual challenge after decades of focusing primarily on other people's needs and goals. I've been thinking about the intersection between renewable energy access and public health, Carol said, referencing a research project she was completing for her community health nursing course. The reliable electricity you've helped provide in Santa Elena is going to have measurable impacts on maternal and infant mortality rates because the clinic can now operate 24 hours a day. The observation connected Emma's work to outcomes she'd never considered, illustrating how engineering decisions could ripple through communities in ways that transcended their immediate technical applications. It also represented the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that had emerged from their family's commitment to authentic conversation rather than surface-level harmony. Have you decided about the advanced research track that Dr. Vasquez mentioned? Patrick asked, referencing the opportunity for Emma to continue renewable energy research while pursuing a master's degree in environmental engineering. I think I want to accept it, Emma said, feeling certain about her choice in ways that her undergraduate education had never inspired. But I want to focus on community-scale installations rather than laboratory research. The work here has convinced me that the most important engineering challenges are in implementation and community engagement, not just technical innovation. The decision represented everything Emma had learned about aligning career choices with personal values rather than external expectations. The advanced research track would be challenging and demanding, but it would also enable her to continue work that felt meaningful rather than simply impressive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.